Today's guest is Dr. William Blau, who is Emeritus Professor at the Department of Anesthesiology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Dr. Blau does research in pain management, genetics, and evolutionary biology, and is the author of the new book, Our Genetic Future: The Unintended Consequences of Overcoming Natural Selection. Thank you, Dr. Blau, for joining us today.
It's my pleasure.
Since your book is called Our Genetic Future: The Unintended Consequences of Overcoming Natural Selection, can you give the audience a quick overview of what it's about and what motivated you to write this book?
Yeah, there's a lot actually packed into that title. The essence is that our species, Homo sapiens, has evolved and our genes have been molded by natural selection over hundreds of thousands of years. But the way in which we're subject to natural selection now is dramatically different than it's been in any time prior in our history. And the reason for that is that we humans have become so proficient at altering our environments in just about any way you can think of, in terms of how we live, where we live, the clothes we wear, the winter coats that we wear, and probably most profoundly, the medical care that we have access to, as well as public health projects that provide reliably clean drinking water and minimal exposure to significant diseases and so on. Because of that, many of the causes of natural selection that were very important to us historically are no longer in effect, basically. And one consequence of that is that natural selection is no longer playing such an important role in maintaining our genetic makeup. What that means is that, as we can discuss, there are many genes that we possess that are not necessarily all that good for us. And there are many new mutations that occur in our genes with each generation. And we run the risk of having increasingly bad genes accumulate within our genome that ultimately will lead to increased human disease. And that's the essence of the argument. I became interested in this in part because I do have a background in evolutionary medicine. Many years ago, completed a doctorate in ecology and evolutionary biology, but turned out to have a completely different career. I went to medical school in about 1983 and ended up practicing medicine for most of my career. And I saw many patients, especially in the field of pain management, which is where I spent most of my time, patients who suffered from maladies that obviously would have been a severe disadvantage in more primitive times when we didn't have such advanced medical care. People who, from an ecological standpoint, would not have been very fit because they might have succumbed early to some form of mortality, or they might have failed to be able to reproduce. And since I tend to think in evolutionary terms, it made me wonder, why are we seeing so many patients who are so impaired and debilitated by any number of diseases you can think of, when historically these people would have been subject to fairly strong natural selection, and the genes that they carry would have been eliminated from the human population. At some point, I decided I would begin to research this topic and see what was written about it, and didn't find very much. And it struck me that most of the people that I knew in healthcare and in public health and so on had never considered the possibility that we might be experiencing kind of a deterioration, if you will, in our genetic makeup, and that might be a cause of concern for future human well-being and the demands on healthcare and public health agencies.
Yeah, I found your book interesting in the sense that, it's like right now where we have a lot of children with autism or ADHD, and we have different cancers and people have diabetes and are overweight. And often people talk about how maybe it's the changing of the food supply, how we have more processed food and artificial chemicals, or a plethora of other reasons, but I've never heard anyone talk about how our gene pool has actually changed. And when I was reading your book, I thought, like, yeah, your book 100% makes sense. Let's just take, say, autism. How much impact do you think does changing genes has? People are having kids later. You're having people that have more artificial type of fertility, whether that's artificial insemination or other tech techniques, and then how does that impact the gene pool? It was quite fascinating.
Well, unfortunately, when you come down to individual examples, it becomes very complicated, as I attempted to show in some of the final chapters talking about particular issues of human well being. And it's complicated because there are numerous issues that you alluded to that also contribute to the likelihood of increasing incidence of diseases, particularly diseases, as you mentioned, like obesity, like cardiovascular disease, and many mental health issues. We are subject to changing environments. We are subject to changing lifestyles. And it's very difficult to sort out what might be genetic effects versus other effects. Obesity, for example, obviously, there are significant lifestyle issues and human behavioral issues that contribute to that. But is it really an underlying genetic issue? I think there's almost certainly a genetic contribution, but at this point, based on the knowledge that we currently have, it's very hard to say exactly how important that is compared to other variables that we're looking at. Autism, in particular, is very interesting from a genetic standpoint because there's some evidence that some of the genes that have been linked to autism show evidence of having been under positive selection previously, possibly for favoring increased imagination or increased intelligence in some respect. But those genes also in our somewhat artificial environment that we live in now also have negative effects that can proliferate if people carrying these genes that make them more liable to express symptoms of autism if these people are surviving and reproducing so that they're passing along these genes to future generations. But how important that is, again, compared to other, environmental exposures, environmental toxins, plastics, hormones, you name it. There are so many other variables that can also contribute. We're still in the early stages of understanding this. And I'll add the reason why this becomes more important to look at now is that over the past 20 years or so, our knowledge and understanding of our genes and how genes work and the actual molecules that make up our genes, that knowledge has exploded. We had the first publication of the human genome back around 2000 or 2001, I believe. And even that wasn't complete. We more recently, within the past year or so, have had a much more complete publication and availability of information on the entire human genome, as well as many other living organisms. And the amount of insight we're gaining and the amount that we're learning is just exponential. It can be overwhelming. So we're in the early stages of our genetic sophistication. And I think as we continue to learn, we'll hopefully be better able to answer some of the questions about how important are genetics going forward compared to other issues of behavior and environment and so on.
You have a quote for you from your book. You write, quote, "It is apparent that what is good for a single individual's health may not necessarily be good for society or humankind in the long term. In fact, the loss of optimal genetics in humans may have profound consequences for society. Increases in genetic disorders or diseases will likely amplify human suffering and disability. To maintain the quality of life and longevity to which we are accustomed, we will need to rely more and more heavily upon existing and evolving medical technologies and social support." And then later on, you kind of talk about rising healthcare costs, things like that. What is going to be the future of healthcare? Are we going to basically get to the point where everyone's going to be relying on artificial either medications or other therapies, that the whole healthcare system is going to be broken, which it's already kind of getting broken now? And then the fact is, I mean, everyone knows that the life expectancy has decreased since COVID, but it actually started before COVID. The life expectancy in the US was declining since 2014. So are we already at the point where this is already having effects?
Well, I think the answer to the last question that you just posed, I think that answer is yes. But at this stage of the game, I would have to characterize that answer as an opinion rather than a firmly established scientific fact. And that gets back to some of the discussions I provided on things like intelligence and fertility and our immune system. There are many reasons to think that we are currently experiencing some of the adverse effects of changes in our genetic makeup, but it's too complicated at this point to say unequivocally that the cause is primarily genetic. It may be, but we just don't know. Getting back to what you were quoting earlier, and thank you for picking up maybe one of the most controversial uh, quotes in the book. If we end up pursuing that a little farther, medicine today is, and it's not a criticism when I say this, but medicine today, because of how it has evolved and because of how we live as human beings, is entirely geared on the individual and keeping the individual alive and keeping the individual as healthy and as functional as possible. When I started attempting to publicize this book, I was contacting many uh, health professionals in the country. I've been contacting many health professionals in the country in fields like evolutionary biology. There's a field called evolutionary medicine, medical genetics, human genetics, ethics, public health, and looking for people who were interested in these kind of global issues about human health and genetic trends or genetic influences on human health going forward. And I found that it was very, very difficult to identify people who had an active interest in this area, particularly within the field of human genetics. There's a phenomenal amount of research going on right now, and all of it is very exciting and very good, but it's uniformly focused on how do we fix specific problems in specific individuals? How do we modify the genetics or understand the genetics better in order to provide better medical care? And almost none of it has a broader scope than that. And again, I'm not saying that's necessarily wrong. I think that's where our focus has always been, is how to improve the medical care of individual people. But I am saying that it may be time now to begin to take a broader view. And in fact, that was one of the primary motivations for my book, was basically to raise consciousness about this issue and understand that the things that we do that are best for individual people may have adverse and unanticipated effects for populations of people, or in fact, the human species over the long term.
So, doctor, how long were you practicing for? Like, you were an anesthesiologist, and then you also were a professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So how long were you working on patients for?
Well, I guess my total career, starting with medical school, spanned about 35 years.
Is there a change from when you started to when you left that you kind of saw just what you were to determine as more diseases of genetics? I feel like you had to have a lot of different factors that inspired you from your experience to develop this thesis.
I would be reluctant to say that I saw genetic trends because, as I said, it's very hard to demonstrate that, although you certainly might suspect that may be occurring. What I wrote about in the book was my experience as director of the pain medicine clinic at the University of North Carolina prior to my retirement. A lot of the work we did was in the management of patients with chronic pain, and probably the most common presentation within the area of chronic pain is patients with chronic low back pain or chronic neck pain. In other words, disorders of the spine. Those disorders themselves are quite complicated because, well, for various reasons. There are many physicians who feel that a lot of the primary issues leading to debilitating pain are more psychosocial than they are medical. Uh, I don't necessarily believe that, although there's certainly psychosocial components to it. But what we do agree on is that the incidence of these types of problems, the people, not necessarily elderly people, but people who are disabled by chronic pain, unable to work, have very difficult lives, has been increasing. At least people who seek medical care for these problems has been increasing dramatically over the past, let's say, 40 years or so. That may be just an issue that people had these problems previously, but kind of dealt with them as best they could and didn't necessarily identify it as a medical problem for which they would seek resolution from their doctors. Chronic pain has become quite publicized as a problem, both in the medical and the general press, and maybe with increased recognition of medical attention to pain, more and more patients are seeking that attention. I do not know the answer, but as I said previously, as an evolutionary biologist, it puzzled me that there were so many more patients presenting with these types of problems, where in the absence of modern medical care, they would have had an extremely difficult time surviving and successfully reproducing. And when I raised this concern to colleagues and researchers, they almost uniformly said, yeah, that is interesting. I never thought about that. And those sorts of responses are what ultimately, and my own curiosity ultimately led me to the book in order to begin to raise consciousness among medical providers and other people about the possibility of this being ultimately a genetic problem.
It's like environmental and genetic, or nature versus nurture. You get into this question, but we've changed the environmental factors so much. I mean, you talk about the germ hypothesis. Basically back in the day, you grew up on a farm, or you were a baby crawling around the farm, or a dirty house now with all the cleaning supplies, and babies are no longer crawling around in, say, dirty atmospheres. And then how many people are born with a C-section? So they're not going actually through the birth canal and picking up the mother's gut bacteria and all that stuff. And then, like, you used to breastfeed. No, well, maybe now you're not breastfeeding anymore. Maybe now you're using some type of baby formula. So, like, the whole environment from being born at 6 months old, we've had so many different environmental factors that have changed. And like you mentioned in the book, you could have two sets of twins, and even living in the same environment, just the way that they actually interpret that environment, they could turn out completely different. But when do you think we've had modern society? Probably 70, 80, 90 years, when everyone's had with medical modern care. I don't know, but it's only been a few generations. So we're at the start of the effects of this, but it seems like it's obviously has to have a major effect. and stuff that we aren't even thinking about.
Well, I I agree with everything you said. Our environments are dramatically different than the type of environments in which we evolved. I'm sorry, historically. In fact, and this is a little bit off topic, but in fact, I speculate that we have become in some ways so out of touch with our own nature as human beings because we currently live in environments that are so dramatically different than the environments we evolved and were adapted to. And I won't say any more about that, but I think the more artificial your environment, the less accurate perspective you have on the whole world and the nature of the world and the nature of our place in it. And that may account for a lot of the problems that we experience in the world these days. But getting back to medicine, you said, well, when might this have started? What's the timeline for when we really seriously began to alter our environments to such an extent that it might change our genetics? And I think a good hallmark for that is if you look at the global population growth. There's a graph in my book that shows population over hundreds or thousands of years. I don't recall the time scale, but it's a very low line indicating a certain very modest population level. And then at some point, uh, the graph goes like this, goes almost straight up as the human population absolutely took off. And that happened in evolutionary time very recently, maybe starting around the early 1800s. Almost a negligible period of time when you think in evolutionary terms. And yet it's an absolutely dramatic change in the dynamics of the human species on this planet. And that growth happened because of many of the changes that I was alluding to, primarily reduction in death rate, because as we began to better increasingly control our environments and better understand the nature of diseases and improve our ability to treat diseases. And so the genetic changes that I've written about are very likely in the earliest of stages. They may already be affecting us, but the greater concern is about where we're going in the future if we have no way to combat the trend towards a less viable human genome.
Yeah, you talked about intelligence in the book, and right now in the United States, at least, the average IQ of a college student is 102, and in 1939 it was 119. And of course, that just I think is more people have been let into the university. But there's countries like Norway, Denmark, and Finland where they've actually seen a decrease in their country's overall IQ, even among families that are intelligent. Their kids are less intelligent than they are. So it's not just less intelligent people are having more kids. That could be part of it, but it's not the only reason. What does this mean going forward, where we're just basically going to have a bunch? It's like the whole movie Idiocracy, right? Where it's like back in in whatever, I forget the year, but in like 500 years they're watering the plants with Gatorade because the plants need their electrolytes or whatever. The smartest person in the planet has an IQ of 100, but like even now, like if you're graduating college and you have an IQ of 102, I don't want a medical doctor operating on me with an IQ of 102. And that's obviously could open up a whole can of worms. But what's your thesis on the whole intelligence going forward and what that means for society?
Well, thank you for consistently asking the most difficult questions. The whole area of intelligence really is a can of worms. It's complex, it's politically charged, and so it's very difficult to say much about it that's definite. And in fact, I thought very carefully about whether or not to write about it. And part of the reason I chose to was because it's something that's of interest to just about everybody. The complexity comes from the number of different factors that influence intelligence. and our limited understanding or ability to quantify the effects of these different factors. So let's look at what you alluded to, which has been called dysgenic fertility. Now, that's a technical term, but basically it's the idea and the reality that in developed societies like much of the Western world, the birth rate and the replacement rate has fallen dramatically over the past 100 years or so. And if you take a look at that, you find fairly consistently that people who are more educated, more intelligent, have led the way in reducing their reproduction, reducing the number of offspring, whereas people who are, I would say, even more average or sort of blue collar in culturally have tended to have higher birth rates. And if you extend that out over time, the implication is, or the worry is that less intelligent people, however you want to define intelligence, are reproducing more, contributing more to future generations. And that's going to bring the average level of intelligence of the whole population down over time. Now, saying that again is is fraught with the potential for misinterpretation and people kind of reacting to it emotionally. But it's out there, and it's been shown that this is a potential problem going forward. Now, is that true? Well, it's been hard to document that it's true because of another factor of that impacts human intelligence. Over the past 100 years or so, again, the environments that we've grown up in have changed dramatically. On the average, our health is better. On the average, our nutrition is better. On the average, our education is probably better. And so there are a lot of environmental changes that are likely to have impacted people achieving their genetic potential of intelligence, which is working in an opposite fashion from the dysgenic fertility that I spoke about a minute ago. In fact, if you look at intelligence in a single place over time, over the past 100 years, the trend has been actually towards increased intelligence. And many people believe that's because of improved environments and improved upbringing that allow people to achieve their potential. Is that an endless process? Well, probably not. It's possible we've kind of optimized or maximized the environmental benefits that lead to improved, uh, reaching our potential. And as you alluded to, there are some places now where it appears that the average level of intelligence is actually beginning to decrease. But is that genetic, or is it due? Some people have suggested it's due to the influx of migrants. And we don't really know the answer for sure at this point. So it is a very difficult area to discuss and a very difficult area to pin down from a scientific standpoint how much genetic change has gone on or is going on that impacts human intelligence. At the same time, at least theoretically, we know that there are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of genes that affect our brains and our cognition. And it's an area that's ripe for deterioration of the genetic basis of intelligence due to the absence of the type of natural selection that we were subject to previously.
When you read a book about fertility, whether it's demographics or in your case, more from genetics and say evolution, the word fitness is used a lot. And I mean, basically, fitness is kind of measured just how many kids you have, right? I mean, how many offspring you have.
It's influenced by the survival to an age where you can begin to reproduce. as well as your reproductive success. So, in its most simplistic terms, yes, it relates to the number of children you leave in the world, but it also may depend on the robustness of those children, the likelihood of those children surviving to reproduce themselves. And it also depends in part on the timing. If you have 10 children in your 20s, as opposed to someone who has 10 children in their latter 30s, the one who reproduces earlier over time is going to contribute many more offspring to the population pool than the one who reproduces later. So all of those factors relate to what ecologists and evolutionists refer to as fitness.
We all know the godfather, whatever, of evolution and whatnot, natural selection is Darwin. But it seems like we always have to have kind of a redefining, though, of how we actually measure, say, success. Just like in the economy, I mean, they use like GDP. Is GDP the best measure of economic healthiness? Probably not. But and Malthus, we all know Malthusian theory about population collapse due to the inability to produce food. And with genetically modified food, the birth control pill, and what was it, 1961, whatever, like Malthus wrote his essay in 1798. And like he couldn't foresee all this stuff, like Darwin's level of fitness basically being the offspring. Now we have artificial techniques to be able to bring people into the world. Are we actually using the right measure in terms with fitness as the actual kind of baseline barometer?
Well, it depends on the context of the conversation. And you said something in your statements just a minute ago that was very telling when you referred to economic health, because I discuss in the book the relationship between fitness, which is an ecological and evolutionary concept having to do with natural selection and evolution, and health, which is related to fitness but is clearly not the same thing. There is some overlap there, but one of the things I point out is that natural selection doesn't necessarily care about how healthy we are and how happy we are. If somehow you manage to survive and reproduce from the standpoint of natural selection and fitness, you're going to be favored. And it doesn't matter if you're a miserable person, and it even doesn't matter if you feel totally healthy, as long as you retain the ability, as long as you survive and retain the ability to reproduce. As a perfect example, you can be the healthiest person in the world. You can live till you're 120 years old. But if you've never produced any children, your ecological fitness is zero. And that's the difference. So if you're talking in evolutionary terms, or if you're talking as an ecologist, to talk about fitness, which is success in surviving and reproducing, that's very appropriate. If you're talking from a more from a society viewpoint or from a health viewpoint, then fitness is what is going to produce the genetic changes, but it's not usually what we're looking at if you're a physician or you're in public health. They're two different things. And sometimes promoting health isn't necessarily promoting evolutionary fitness in the same way that promoting individual health isn't necessarily good for the genetics of human populations in the long term. So we need to be careful about how we use these terms and the context in which we're using these terms.
You think we've kind of maybe say have reached peak humanness, so to speak? It's like when we're talking about how maybe we've hit peak intelligence, but we live such kind of a soft life now. Like, how often do people even have to really use their brain every day? People certainly don't have to use their physical. Even if you're a farmer, it's not like you're out there with a hoe and a shovel, and you're driving a tractor. If you're an office worker, you using Excel or AI technology, you're not really using your brain that much. To think 100 years ago, you probably built your own house. You constantly were using your mind, your body, and today we're not. And then you have all these increases in mental illness, and you have a whole generation of parents that grew up with technology, and now they're having kids. What's the impact of that? But kind of reading your book, it made me think like we probably have actually surpassed peak humanism, and now we're moving on the downward slope of it. But I mean, maybe my interpretation of the reading was different than you see it.
Well, uh, in a way, I agree with what you're saying. I think when you say things like peak humanism or we're as good as we're going to get, there are value judgments you're implying there, and I think we have to be careful about that because what's optimal or what's most human to one person might not be the same as it is for the next person. But in a general sense, I agree with what you're saying. One of the arguments is that many of our societies are so structured that you don't have to be a physicist to benefit from our ability to use nuclear energy, or hopefully in the near future, energy from the fission process. You don't have to be a doctor to benefit from the availability of medicines and surgeries and other types of medical care that are available to the general population. So there's a concern then that should the systems that we have created for ourselves fail, we have evolved now, and I'm using that term somewhat loosely, but we've evolved to live within societies that provide services to us by people who, in general, are fairly high functioning in those societies. And one of the risks we face is that, as you said, we no longer really know how to kind of fend for ourselves in a more natural world. And if the mechanisms we have built within our societies that take care of us should fail, and it's not too hard to see that happening. Think of nuclear war. Even short of a nuclear war, think of a severe solar storm that knocks out all of our communications and our internet. Just think for a minute how many of our lives would be without internet access. It's really striking. Think of pandemics. We know a lot about pandemics right now and the stresses they cause within societies. If we lose the structures that we've constructed for ourselves, many of us are going to find ourselves in very big trouble if we have to go back to relying on our own knowledge and abilities in order to support our lives in a more primitive environment. So that is a significant concern. And in a way, losing our ability over the past couple of hundred years or so to fend for ourselves, to provide our own food, to provide our own shelter, losing those abilities may, in a sense, mean that we've gone beyond the peak of human potential and ability. Now, a lot of that is, again, is environmental. It's not necessarily all genetic, but as with everything else we've discussed, there is very possibly a genetic component as well.
You got another quote from your book, and in this you say, quote, "It is difficult to make any predictions with certainty. The evolving genetic architecture of human traits results from the complex interplay among genes and their expression." And basically, you go on to say that there's basically a 3 to 5% increase in harmful traits per generation that's cited by the WHO, and that additional estimates have been offered by other authors. And then you put some numbers there. But how much mutations, like bad mutations, are we putting into the gene pool right now? And then also you talk about demographics, and I've had a couple different podcasts about demographics, but right now the global fertility rate is like 2.3, 2.1 is kind of replacement rate. So we're kind of getting to the point where we're even globally barely above replacement rate. And then when you're adding in all these kind of bad genes, I mean, the UN has their own predictions on population, but you have people like Peter Zihan and others that talk about one of the biggest threats to humanity coming up the next 50 years is going to be a population collapse. And when you start looking at all the potential different illnesses we're going to be facing with a dwindling population, that's a really real possibility of a major population collapse globally in the next 50 years.
Well, again, uh, you said a lot of important things there. It's important to bear in mind that there is already um, we already have a lot of genes that are not necessarily associated with the best of health. So, take an example of one of the examples in the book, which I think you were alluding to in some of the numbers you quoted, are newborn babies who are born with physical malformation leading to something called pyloric stenosis, where the stomach doesn't empty properly. And if that's not corrected, the likelihood of survival and those babies thriving is very small. But there are well established surgical techniques for going in, correcting the pyloric stenosis, and allowing those individuals to have more or less normal lives. But it's been found that babies with pyloric stenosis that's been treated who grow up and then have their own babies have a slightly higher percentage risk of having babies with pyloric stenosis. That's where some of the numbers come from. And to the extent that that disorder is genetically based, what we're seeing is that the genes leading to pyloric stenosis have the potential to kind of infiltrate and increase in our populations. That has to do with my whole argument regarding natural selection, where those babies would not have survived and reproduced in more primitive times. But another factor that's worrisome from a genetic standpoint is the amazing population growth that we were talking about a few minutes ago. When populations, and I will say that that population growth itself is a reflection of the lack of natural selection. Natural selection, let's be clear, works when people fail to live to reproductive age or fail to reproduce. And the fact that almost everybody now has the chance to survive and reproduce compared to the historical situation, that's a reflection of the absence of the mechanisms of natural selection. And when you have population growth like that, we do know for a fact that many new mutations, because mutations occur with every generation and every new individual, many new mutations have been introduced into the human population as this dramatic population growth has occurred. So, for various reasons, we already have many less good genes in our midst. And the only real way to correct that situation, whether the population is growing or whether the population is shrinking, is to allow natural selection to come back and exercise its authority, in a sense, over our genome. Now, no one's suggesting that we do that because, again, even though that may be good for us in the long term, it's definitely not good for individuals. And we have serious ethical problems with that contradiction. But I agree with you that I think overall, again, in the long term, less population growth, less reproduction is a good thing, both for humanity, for the planet, and many other reasons we can think of. And most of the problems it poses are economic. That's what people worry about the most, is that decreasing economic demand and less growth in the economy. That in itself may not be a bad thing, but it requires, as you were suggesting earlier, maybe different metrics for what is good economically and what is not good economically. We need to think that growth isn't the ultimate good of economy, but the combination of shrinking population and potentially less genetically well individuals should be a real concern for our future.
Yeah, there's a lot of different kind of concepts you talk in the book. One of them is the bottleneck, yeah, and then the serial founder effect. And I have this quote that I found to be quite interesting. You say the French Canadian population provides a well documented example of serial founder effects. Most of the current population, numbering over 8 million, is derived from about 8,500 French settlers who initially established colonies along the St. Lawrence River between 1608 and 1759. Only 2,600 of these settlers present before 1680 account for about two-thirds of the genetic makeup of the current population. And we all heard, like, was it 7 degrees from Kevin Bacon or whatever, what's that expression, right? But basically, we're all very similar related, but it's quite, I found it to be quite shocking that of the over 8 million French Canadians, that you basically attribute the vast majority to only 8,500 of them. And it just kind of shows you, though, how a gene pool is not really derived from that many people, especially if you're going to have certain people having the majority of kids, and how you can really skew those. It's not necessarily like just flipping a coin and having this 50-50 outcome.
Right. And from what I've read, I think it's not unusual if you look back at the actual genealogy that many modern day populations are found to be derived from a relatively small portion of our progenitors, many generations ago. What you bring up about founder effects and serial founder effects really has a lot to do with randomness in which genes get passed along from one generation to the next. I don't know, say you have a world with that there are 10 different types of people in the world. However you want to categorize it, 10 different types of hair color, eye color, height. In an imaginary world, there are 10 types. And in a population of people that is randomly mating and producing subsequent generations, in the absence of natural selection to change things, you would expect there over time to continue to be 10 different types of people. But when people leave to colonize a new geographic area, which has happened repeatedly over millennia in the human history, often it's a small group of people. So if you take a population of 10 people, each one of them different, and only 3 or 4 of them go and colonize a new area. And if they succeed and they reproduce, they're going to be producing a population that is significantly different from the population they came from. It's going to be different because there are only going to be certain of those 10 types that are represented. It's also going to be different because in smaller populations, natural selection doesn't work very effectively. And it's much easier to randomly bring along some mutations into the new population that may then become much more frequent than they were in the source population. And that's exactly what you see in the French Canadian populations. As is very well known, they are subject to a number of different genetic maladies that aren't common elsewhere, but are relatively common within the French Canadian population because their particular selection of genes and the mutations that they carry were a very limited example of the original French population that they came from. That's another contributing factor to the risk that exists within our genome that can cause problems when natural selection is no longer acting to eliminate the genes that are causing problems for us from a fitness standpoint.
Whenever I read books, I always like books that talk about solutions instead of just the problems. I think the problems are always the easy thing to talk about. What are some of the solutions? Your book's called The Genetic Future, The Unintended Consequences of Overcoming Natural Selection. So, what are some of the solutions to overcoming natural selection?
Well, it's right. There are people who have, and this not recently, but there are people in the past who have written that we should actually allow natural selection to begin to exercise its authority again in order to combat this problem. Obviously, you'd find very few people, I think, in this modern age who would make such a suggestion. And I am not suggesting this. And that presents a dilemma because the only way to, in a way, artificially introduce natural selection without imposing uh, death or um, is in order to mold the genome without natural selection would be to impose some sort of unnatural selection. In other words, humans deciding themselves which people, based on the more favorable genes they carry, uh, are allowed to basically reproduce and contribute to future generations. Everybody now who's hearing this is thinking, eugenics. We've kind of been there, done that, found out it was a terrible thing, and we don't even want to talk about that again. The problem, and we're not going to get, my hope is for us not to get into a conversation about the history of eugenics, but clearly a lot of the history that people react to have to do with things like enforced sterilization, uh, on certain groups of people, and everything else leading up to World War II and the attempt by the German regime to entirely wipe out a particular genetically identifiable group of people. None of this clearly is acceptable, and none of this is something that would seriously be considered as a solution to our current dilemma. However, it's hard to see any way out of it without, in some way, trying to avoid the pitfalls of passing along some of the most dangerous genes and gene combinations to future generations. If we are to do that, it has to be on a voluntary basis. It has to rely on education and genetic screening. And I don't want to say a whole lot about that, except that we have, with the tremendous development in our genetic understanding and technical abilities over the past 20 years, we now have greater than we ever had abilities to genetically screen people and even look at their entire genome and understand what genes they may be carrying that may predispose to certain diseases. And if you, as an individual, understand that you might have say, a 50% chance of passing along a very bad gene to your children, and you are educated about this, you may justifiably decide not to do that. And there are ways around it. You can use a sperm donor for a male instead of contributing your own sperm. You can screen human embryos for the possibility that they might be carrying some of these bad genes, and only choose human embryos for in vitro, reproduction we know carry acceptable genes. This is all ethically very dangerous stuff, very difficult stuff to sort out. But it's already happening. And it's not necessarily happening for the right reasons. Some people now actually, if they go to sperm donation and in vitro fertilization, people right now have the capability in some situations to choose sperm donors who are more good looking or who have higher intelligence or who have certain color hair or certain color eyes. This is being done, and it's not being done in the context of any type of regulation or any ethical second guessing. So there's a great deal of need right now for the medical establishment to be looking at reproduction and how we go about it, and take a very close look at the ethics in order to guide us going into the future. The other hope is that our medical technologies, including genetics, become so highly refined that we are better able to treat any of the medical disorders or diseases that we may find becoming more frequent over the generations. There is real potential for this. We now have genetic therapies for a number of relatively simple genetic orders, like sickle cell anemia and some genetic motor disorders. The problems in the present time is that the development of these technologies has been very uh, relies on a high level of technology, and it has been very expensive. And some of the newer genetic therapies that have become available, as exciting as they are, cost in the millions of dollars. They're obviously not available to everybody and obviously problematic to be covered by insurance if they begin to be used more widely. So we have a lot of medical challenges in terms of being able to improve medical therapy to meet increasing demand, but to do it in a way that's economically feasible and affordable for people. Now, I've mentioned a lot of different things, each of which is complex and difficult to talk about. And the bottom line, I'm afraid I need to leave you with, is that I do not have a clear answer. And I don't think there is a simple answer for how do we combat the possibility of our declining genetic quality over time. There isn't a simple answer, but ignoring the problem certainly isn't an answer. I think we need some of our brightest minds, both within medical fields, fields of public health and public policy, and within the fields of ethics to begin looking at these issues very closely and helping to generate guidance for both the medical establishment and all of the rest of us to know the best road for proceeding forward.
Dr. Blau, just before we leave, switching gears, you did specialize in pain management. You talked early in your book about your career with back pain, neck pain, things like that. And my audience is a little bit older, people that are retired, and with the baby boomers, most baby boomers, what are 65 plus now. So we have this huge cohort of people that are getting into their kind of the twilight years. But what advice do you have? I mean, you look like you're pretty spry and in shape, so I think you're practicing what you're preaching to your patients over the years. But I mean, what's just advice?
Exception with the term twilight years, but
Well, maybe not.
go ahead.
I mean, my I guess my definition is different than yours since we're at a different. I'm not certainly trying to say that you're at death's door or something like that, but you get what I'm saying. But what's some advice that older people can kind of implement that will allow them to live into their 70s and 80s and 90s and have fun and enjoy their retirement years? If you're not healthy, it's hard to enjoy. You can't have fun when you're bedridden or sick or in pain. So, what are strategies that they can implement?
Well, this is not necessarily an area in which I have particular expertise, probably mostly so because of my age. I have thought about these questions that you pose. To a certain extent, the answer to that question relies on good luck and lifestyle issues that are addressed before you get into your twilight years. And there are books that have been written about this. You probably are aware of them. But one of the books was about some very long term studies that followed people from their reproductive years all the way through to retirement years and tried to look at what went into people being happy and satisfied in their later years. And as I said, some of it was lifestyle issues. If you're not a cigarette smoker and if you're not morbidly obese, that adds a lot to the likelihood of your being healthy and happy in your later years. From a medical standpoint, if you don't have diabetes, if you don't have chronic depression, if you haven't been unfortunate enough to acquire genes that put you at higher risk for cardiovascular disease and so on, the chances are quite good that you'll live to your later years and have a satisfying life at that time. My personal belief for people who are already there, like myself, and you can't go back and change the past at this point, is that the more you, and I'm not the only one to say this for sure, but the more you stay active, activity, if you're able to do it or the extent to which you do it, is essential for your ongoing health in later years and your mental well being. So, activity and exercise is very important. Maintaining social connections and being involved with other people has been found to be very important. And my personal feeling is relevance. I think one of the great risks of being in an older age group, especially post retirement, is that people sort of enter their twilight years. They're no longer seen as important or as relevant to other people. In fact, we visited a retirement community recently where they joke about what they call PIPs in the retirement community, and that's previously important people. It's kind of a joke, but there's also a truth to it. So, my suggestion is to find things to do in your life that take advantage of your strengths and allow you to contribute to be a contributing member of society in whatever way you see that has value. I think that leads to a lot of satisfaction in later years as opposed to becoming more isolated and feeling of less worth in your life.
Today's guest is Dr. William Blau, who is the author of the book Our Genetic Future, The Unintended Consequences of Overcoming Natural Selection. So I want to thank you so much for joining us today. I have two final questions. Just one, where can people find you, find your book, get a hold of you? And then the last question after that is just leave us with a final thought.
As far as the book goes, this book was published independently, meaning I'm not associated with a professional publishing house. It was published on Amazon, and right now, at least, that is the one resource for obtaining the book or looking at it more closely if someone is interested. So if you go onto Amazon in the book section and search for my name and the title of the book, you will find it, and you can find more information about the book there. It is also available in paperback version and electronic version for people who are reading on Kindle or other electronic devices. And one final word, I guess, is that I'm very concerned these days about the politicization of science and some of the implications that has for some of the things going on in our country and the confidence that the general public has in science these days. And a lot of that has to do with questionable sources of information and even disinformation that's out there. So I guess my final thought would be for people, please, to be conscientious about the information they receive and they respond to. Know where it's coming from, know whether it's validated information or not.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.